What's good, film fans? What's good? Another grey, miserable day here in England. But hey, we're going to have a lot more to follow now that autumn and winter are coming. And of course, Halloween is soon coming, in a month or so, which brings us nicely onto this film, I think, which of course is William Friedkin's iconic film, The Exorcist. This is the second film of his that I'm looking at for this series. The first, of course, being The French Connection, which I've already looked at, and then doing The Exorcist now, and then I'll be doing Sorcerer for the third and final video, which is basically just a kind of like a celebration or just a kind of recollection and look back at some of the key works of his career, which really Friedkin was most prominent and respected, I think, as a director in the 70s, although he did some interesting work, particularly in the 80s as well. But he fell on increasingly hard times, I think, as his career unfolded and found it difficult to get projects off the ground. Which is quite remarkable thing when you think back of particularly this 1-2 punch of The French Connection, followed by just merely 2 years later, The Exorcist, which was a huge hit. And again, it didn't do as well in the Oscars in terms of wins, but it got, I think, eight nominations, I think. So it did, and for a horror film, that's pretty remarkable. And we could talk about maybe why is that is the case. And of course, the film is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And I think just been released has been a 4K restoration of this film here in England anyway. I think that might be the case in the US as well, I'm not too sure, but in some nice limited edition sets, which I did manage to get a hold of. They sold out very, very quick over here, actually. So I had to settle for watching the Blu-ray in preparation for this video. But then again, I've never seen it on Blu-ray before either, actually. And so I opted for there's two kind of major kind of cuts of this movie. And that is, of course, the original 1973 theatrical version, and then the kind of the 2000 version, which Friedkin added some extra footage in, about 10 minutes that he cut from it, from the theatrical release. 10 minutes in that to kind of like appease and the author of both the book and the adapted screenplay, which was used to obviously film The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty, who was always disappointed that this 10 minutes of footage was cut out. I think this was the first time that I've actually seen this version, because that's the version that I watched. And I didn't realise kind of really until quite a way in, because The Exorcist is a film I've seen a few times, but I'm not overly familiar with the film in terms of like, I know every single scene and what scene's going to follow the preceding one and so on and so forth. So I first saw The Exorcist when I was, again, too young to see such things when I was a kid, probably around 13, 14, so when I was a teenager. Kind of upon the recommendation and word of mouth. It's one of those films you just kind of have to see, right? Particularly when you're a teenager, because you see horror films as a kind of personal dare and challenge to see if you can get yourself into a kind of worked up emotional state whilst watching it and be horrified. And in fact, my stepdad at the time told me, that he saw it when it came out back in 1973, and he said it scared the shit out of him, and everyone else at the time was scared of this film. So I remember watching it on my own in the living room. It was a televised broadcast of the film, so it was very late, and I think it must have been around Halloween time, therefore, that it was on. So it certainly made an impression in the sense that I can remember exactly where I was, and I can remember the first time watching it. But as a kind of, what I suppose you would call a kind of modern day young kid at the time watching it, a few years had obviously passed since the film's release, and that word of mouth builds up that reputation to a point where it can't help but disappoint a little bit. But I think there's some kind of more in-depth reasons as to why that might be the case. Particularly for someone who's a younger watching it, the film has a distinct pace, even compared to like a lot of modern day horror films. And horror is kind of going through a real kind of boom and resurgent period at the moment, I would say, the last 10 years. But with The Exorcist, I think it does have a really distinct sense of pacing, actually akin to The French Connection, which I talked about in that video, where I talked about the idea of that Friedkin uses this kind of temporal compression in The French Connection, which creates this sense of you're not aware necessarily of how much time is passing between scenes or even within the narrative as a whole. And you get the same sense with The Exorcist. You don't quite know, it's that kind of self-contained. Here, mainly to like kind of one location, pretty much. And you could even argue distinctly one room within the house, that kind of iconic location. That brings with it a sense of kind of isolation, disorientation, some kind of prerequisites to enhancing the horror that's to be found within this film. But just basically some kind of brief thoughts on kind of positives and negatives that I find with this film. I'm definitely in the position where I kind of admire The Exorcist more than I love it. I'm not like, for example, we have a critic over here, of course, Mark Kermode, famous British critic, who famously cites The Exorcist to be the greatest film ever made. Now, I'm not quite in that camp, but and indeed I don't consider it to be my favourite or the best Centers horror film. But The Exorcist, nonetheless, it comes so loaded with classic status and expectation. Sometimes it's quite hard to step back and unpack all of that. You've got to remember this is almost akin to how 2001: A Space Odyssey was the kind of film that really. It was like that was seen as like the first film to kind of like, for a lot of people, that took science fiction seriously or took some kind of a cerebral intellectual approach to science fiction. The Exorcist is analogous to that in horror, I think. The Oscars nominations, like I say, is rare for horror category in general, as it is in science fiction. Kind of tells you culturally how the film was received, that it was a film to be taken seriously. And I think a lot of the merit in The Exorcist is to be placed at both Blatty and Friedkin's feet, where they take an earnest approach to the material. They take this deadly seriously. It could be very easy to take a kind of mocking or B-movie or schlock factor to this film, but they don't do that. They respect. I think they actually take a very serious look at the nature of faith and religion, quite earnestly, actually, at a time where obviously society was becoming, back in the 70s, more secular, more atheist, more conflicted, perhaps, in terms of kind of spiritual values, and of course that this is akin to, and I think The Exorcist is very much a film of its time. And Stephen King, I think, famously said that The Exorcist is almost certainly, he considers it to be a social horror film. And I think what he means about that is that the kind of socio-political context of the time and of which The Exorcist was made, it's kind of inseparable. It's there in the background, because I don't think Friedkin is ultimately too interested in those things. I think if anything, he's taking a more, I would actually say, a more kind of conservative, reactionary approach to the times. I mean, there's a lot of analysis on The Exorcist in terms of its kind of social, political themes and messaging in the film. Some would say it's progressive, some would say it's reactionary. I tend to maybe perhaps side a bit more with the reactionary. I think the film is indicative of, like I say, the time it was made, like The French Connection. The French Connection being a kind of cynical, downbeat, pessimistic film that really is indicative of so many of the great new Hollywood films of the 70s. The Exorcist is the same thing, in the sense that you could argue The Exorcist is symptomatic of the uncertainty and skepticism that plagued the time. Remember, this is right when the Watergate scandal is ongoing. You have political corruption, political assassinations, assassinations on all kinds of the spectrum, really, socially speaking and politically speaking. You have civil unrest, mass protests of the Vietnam War, the failure of the 60s to kind of bring about, the failure of the optimism of the 60s to bring about something better in terms of social and political change. All of that is kind of infused on a kind of background level. It's bubbling under, I think, with The Exorcist. Because with The Exorcist, you kind of have this two-handed approach where And this is indicative in the intercutting approach that Friedkin uses a lot throughout the film, where you have Father Karras's character, who's emblematic of religious skepticism, and he's questioning his own faith, really, because he's questioning whether he wants to provide a kind of religious service anymore, whether he even actually does any good for anyone, really. And which is kind of maybe underpinned by a selfish desire to live his own kind of life as he wants to on his own terms, coupled with the skepticism and the critique of kind of the limits of rationality, particularly of science and medicine-based science. I think actually some of the most horror-inducing scenes in The Exorcist are where, which I don't need to surmise the plot, right? You know, the idea of the possession of Regan, who's played by Linda Blair, iconic role. She's put through this kind of this battery, a series of medical tests to see what's wrong with her. They suspect it could be something to do with the frontal lobe in her brain. She's put through all these tests, and they're made out to be like very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable viewing, to be honest with you, because you're seeing essentially a child subjected to these tests with this kind of like horrific, especially now looking back, these kind of horrific, primitive machinery, almost medical machinery that fails to find the cause. And of course, then when that doesn't work, the doctor suggests, look, let's bring in psychiatry. The institution of psychiatry will help. You know, it's got to be something to do with multiple personalities, maybe, and that doesn't work. And that's when they turn to the religious. It's almost like it's a religious problem. It's a spiritual problem. And credit to Friedkin that I think he deals with both on a kind of same level of seriousness and subjects both to a similar level of critique, I think. Or just even questions, where do they place in a society where America was at the time? What does it even mean anymore, these things? Have we lost a kind of sense of place and centrality to what these values, what these things hold to us, rationality and faith? So there are serious things going on with the film, and the film, of course, has a very, very slow pace. I shouldn't say a very, very slow pace, but compared to a lot of horror films, you don't really get any sense of kind of dread or scares until like 40, 45 minutes in. And actually, a lot of my favourite scenes some of them are within the first 40, 45 minutes. I love just that tracking shot on the sidewalk of the mother, Ellen Burstyn's character, where she's heading home, right? And then you hear the soundtrack, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, which is kind of more associated now with The Exorcist than that album itself. The theme plays, and the wind's blowing, the leaves are rustling, and it's Halloween. You see the kids in costume walking past or running past her, and it does create a real evocative sense of place in the setting of Georgetown, which is where this house is. And for me, those are the scenes that, and they're only small moments, but I think they really, really help, ground the film, I think. Because I think the reason why people found this film so horrific is because of the construction of the film. That is, Friedkin establishes a world within which then this real kind of claustrophobic almost sense of horror takes place, in the sense that it's localized, this one bedroom, right? And going back to actually this longer director's cut of the film, as it were, which is, like I say, is about 10 minutes longer. There is a scene late on in the film where both Father Karras and, of course, the iconic Max von Sydow's character, who arrives to perform he's the main father, the priest, to perform the exorcism at the end. They have this conversation on the stairs outside the bedroom of, what does it all mean? Why this girl? Why has she been the one that's been possessed? And Friedkin himself has talked about how he didn't like that scene and removed it on first cut, the theatrical cut of the film, because it too literally espouses the kind of what the film is about, and it shouldn't need to be verbalized in a scene like that. And as much as I kind of like the scene in its isolation, I kind of agree with him. I think that that scene doesn't need to be spout out for the audience. At least that's how I feel looking at it now, because you have the sense of distance with the film. 50 years worth of distance, half a century, which is hard to believe. But yeah, I'm not necessarily a huge... In fact, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the inserts in general. I think where Reagan does the spider walk down the stairs comes across a little bit hokey. And in fact, I don't like any of those elements where she's kind of outside the bedroom too much, apart from the early scenes of her possession, where she kind of comes down and says to the character of Burke that he, I think it's the character of Burke, isn't it, that you're going to die, essentially. She bows out his fate, and then she kind of like wets herself on the floor in front of all the guests. That's a great scene, because that's really, really unsettling, because we haven't got to the full horror of what's to come yet. And again, credit to Friedkin, where these moments of horror that we do see and disgust, they're not treated like set pieces. They're kind of, they're just, it's really well paced how he kind of constructs these little moments that are then, they're kind of built up nicely in between the kind of the mundanity of the domesticity of the home and then these horrific things that are happening in this bedroom. It forms like a nice juxtaposition, I think. And of course, the exorcism scene, with the first attempt at the exorcism anyway, where both fathers are in there, is an incredible scene it's just so well constructed. I don't even know how long that scene is, maybe about 5-10 minutes long. But it's an incredibly intense scene that plays out. And you completely buy it, I think. You just completely are lost in this. Because for someone who's like not religious at all, who is an atheist, you kind of buy this scene, I think. It doesn't feel ridiculous. And that's testament to the film, I think. Because me personally, my own subjective experience with horror is I struggle more with supernatural horror films because of maybe it's because of I struggle to relate to them in the sense that I feel that they're far less likely to happen, right? They're supernatural. It's far less relatable for me, and it's harder to suspend my disbelief as a viewer, I find. Whereas I know a lot of people actually prefer that almost, but for me that's more comforting because I know it's a bit more abstract. It can't really happen unless you're kind of like a highly superstitious individual, and you can get yourself into that mindset. I think I don't want to say the flaws of the film, The Exorcist, but I think the innate kind of problem of maybe horror films, maybe even of that period, but I think in particular The Exorcist, one, of course, like I say, is the pacing. I think a lot of modern audiences will just... I personally think the pacing and the build is great, but a lot of modern audiences won't feel that way, I think. And I think horror is a genre that in general kind of ages quite badly. I think the effects hold up brilliantly, personally speaking, and I'm a huge fan of kind of like analog in-camera special effects. Love them, okay? And I'm someone who's actually very critical of CGI. Although I think some digital effects were used to kind of clean up certain shots here and there in the 2000 extended cut, but I think because horror ages. The reason why horror ages is because I think we've reached a generalized... I think audiences now have this generalized cynicism and level of superiority where they see horror films as a challenge to not be scared and to actually laugh at them. And I think the almost like existential problem of The Exorcist is, for the film to have been made, we are already over the fears that it's trying to extrapolate and exploit in us. That is the kind of the scandalous shock value of The Exorcist. It's paradoxical, right? The shock that's there in The Exorcist is it's already been overcome because the audiences are ready to be challenged by it. So there's no real sense of, even though there was a lot of, look, The Exorcist is the kind of, in some ways, it's the prototypical event horror movie. Even the precursor to Jaws, which came out in 1975. I think The Exorcist was an event movie. People, word of mouth, people went, queued up to see it because they wanted to be shocked and they wanted to see these transgressive, tackle the kind of taboo subject of religion and horror. Oh, you can't, you can't touch that, it's sacred. But I think the fact that it was already able to be filmed and allowed to be made suggests a point that audiences had already overcome that. So I think audiences are already ahead of the curve in terms of what they're able to really tolerate. And I think that's why horror in some form ages badly. I think now it's very easy to look at The Exorcist and kind of like mock it. Maybe because it is a film that tries to take itself seriously, which I admire personally. I'd rather that than, the kind of it take a kind of, like I say, a schlocky B movie approach. But it's I just think it's a film which I think the horror that to be found in that film is, I don't know, I think we've kind of like, it's of its time. I really, and like I'm saying, I'm questioning even if it was of its time, really. I'm not saying that people weren't scared, people weren't fainting in the theatres and all that kind of stuff. But when you look at The Exorcist and you strip that away and all that's left, I just think that horror's reached a place now where, of course, more and more transgressive things have to happen. I'm not even purely saying this is down to the desensitization of audiences. I'm saying that there's something within the horror genre of itself that I think, particularly when it lends itself to the supernatural, and particularly when it lends itself to something like religion, that the taboo subjects, I suppose, that we've kind of moved beyond, that is indicative of something that's far more culturally embedded, that we can't quite recover, I don't think. I'm trying to explain why, perhaps for me, and why it's particularly, I think, a phenomenon for modern audiences in general, why they wouldn't get The Exorcist. I try to explain the kind of cultural phenomena, perhaps, of why, if The Exorcist was released today, it just because it was such a huge event movie back then. Like I say, it was an event movie in every sense of the word, and it was hugely commercially successful, not unanimously critically successful, but I doubt it's going to be when it tackles the subjects that it does. That I just think it just wouldn't have the success that it did back then. And I don't know the kind of last real kind of cultural event horror movie. Would I have to go all the way back to something like Blair Witch? I'm not sure. I don't know. And there's me saying horror's in a great state of affairs. I think it is. I think there's a lot of interesting horror movies that are being made nowadays. But yeah, so my kind of summary of my opinion on The Exorcist is as follows. It's just that it's a film I admire, particularly in terms of its construction, more than I actually like. There's a lot of 70s horror that I love and admire more, I think, than The Exorcist. You could say that's the testament to the true greatness of The Exorcist, right? Because you're not really meant to like horror films. The more you're horrified and repulsed by it, that's actually a good thing. But I'm not saying I'm horrified and repulsed by The Exorcist. I'm just, if anything, I think I'm more concerned by how I think it's a good test case for how horror ages in a cultural sense, I think. But yeah, those are my main thoughts on watching it. I think like I said, I think it's a brilliantly made film. And I just think that Friedkin can never repeat the highs, the success of those first two films in terms of, and he never did. Although it will be interesting to see now The Sorcerer, which is the next one I'm going to talk about, which is really seen as a kind of, it's gone for a critical re-evaluation, is now seen as a kind of cult classic. And it was ostensibly a kind of remake of the French film Wages of Fear by Henri-Georges Clouzot from the 50s. So that'd be interesting to see that film for the first time. Looking forward to that. That'll be obviously the next and final film in this series. Let me know your thoughts on The Exorcist. It's like I say, 50th anniversary, 50 years. Are you watching it this Halloween? Have you watched it recently? Got the 4K of the film? Let me know what you think. Is it? I get that it's going to be culturally entrenched for a lot of people. They're going to have a lot of nostalgia tied to the film, perhaps. Did you see it when it came out, perhaps? If any of the older viewers of this channel. I've not been fortunate enough to see it in the cinema. Maybe that'll give me a whole new appreciation of it. And I do appreciate the film. Like I say, I admire it more than I like it. It wouldn't be one of my go-to horror films to watch, particularly from the 70s. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like and comment for the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, if you want to see more content like this. And yeah, join me on the next one. And as always, take it easy and take care. I'll see you next time.